I was scrolling by HLTV and I read something that I think is a super underrated piece of advice that can not only improve your team games, but also your pugs. Luck says, "We don't use the same positions on every map. We think that if we do that, we burn the confidence of the player." By the end of this video, you'll know exactly what this approach is, why it can make your games better, and I'm also going to give you my personal cheat sheet to select which roles you'll be playing based on CT side data. On top of that, I'll also tell you the case where you shouldn't follow this advice based on the types of players you're playing with. The examples I'm giving here are mostly going to be about the CT side, but you can take the same concept and also take it over to the team. You see, because we love familiarity, we gravitate towards one style of play or one archetype of play, which means we end up pigeonholing ourselves into positions or roles that we think we should fit in. The guy who plays mid on Mirage might also play double doors on Dust 2, and they also might play outside on Nuke. So you might be asking yourself, what's the issue with sticking players in the same roles on every map? Well, let's take a look at a few examples of how this can be bad. First up, the player ends up under or over preparing. Small bomb site anchors have way less workload outside of the server than players who are playing in high-risk positions. This results in the high engagement players having a harder time perfecting everything because there are many more protocols to perfect. To make this easier to understand, think of what a Dust 2B anchor has to do versus how dynamic playing short is. Secondly, players can be burnt out from only playing a specific style. If you're always the guy who plays small bomb sites, it's much easier to stay fresh through multiple maps, but if you have high engagement and variability in what you have to do because you're playing much more hands-on, you'll be burnt out in a couple of maps since the level of mental stimulus is much higher. To simplify, you get way more mentally taxed when you're fighting short on Mirage than you do jump spotting apartments. And if you're thinking that you're always going to have to put star players in the hardest positions, you've got to remember, stars aren't uniform. A player might be a star on a specific map's role, and their ability to perform a role really well might never be explored properly if they're always relegated to a role because of an archetype. The chronic B jump spotter who also chronically anchors A on Ancient may never get to express how good they are when they play middle. Similarly, a monstrous Mirage connector or mid player may not be great at playing outside on Nuke, but still be pigeonholed into that role. And that's what I personally got from what we read in that interview earlier. Being unable to express your strengths kills confidence, not just because of a lack of responsibility, but also because your strengths are never being used. And I want to connect this to how this can be useful to your pugs. So in the context of pugs, a player doesn't develop completely because they never put themselves in the shoes of their teammates. And as a result, they also misunderstand what is required of them because they're never quite getting to see how their teammates' positions influence their ability to perform. If you want to get good at the game at an individual level, you need reps in different styles. That is how you'll set appropriate expectations from teammates. Now let's explore how Pain have a lot of role diversity to put the idea of breaking role archetypes into practice. To illustrate how good the division of roles is across maps from Pain, I want to show you a really important graph put together by Nero using Skybox Edge. For now, we're only focusing on how difficult a bomb site is to hold. We can generally categorize bomb sites into how hard or easy to hold they are as follows. We've got the hard holds list, and then we've got the easy holds list. On top of this, I'd also like to categorize certain roles on each map as either higher, moderate, or low engagement. And this information is important because it helps us understand the following concept. A player that is not being restricted to any archetypes will be given a mix of higher and lower engagements and easier and harder bomb sites to hold. With this concept in mind, we can test this against No's positions on Team Pain. Across 5 maps that I examined, he's playing a pretty solid mix of all types of engagement levels and harder and easier bomb sites. So it's pretty clear that a player like Snow isn't always being given easier or harder roles, but rather a pretty good mix of them. Now that you understand that an even distribution of roles requires exposure to multiple difficulties and engagement levels, we can now start to figure out how you can very easily test this on yourself. But before I get into how you can use this information to your advantage, I'd like to thank the sponsor of this video. The sense of discomfort and urgency I feel knowing that my channel is still 3,500 hours of watch time away from being monetized. Seriously, if it wasn't for the fear of being irrelevant and fading into obscurity as a tier 4 yapper in the hellhole that is Counter-Strike esports, I don't think I'd be able to make these videos. But yeah, I've got nothing to sell you other than the subscribe button. Okay, back to the video. Here's how you can use the chart I showed earlier to select an even distribution of difficult and easy bomb sites. Look at the map pool. Pick which bomb site you're currently playing on for each map and see whether or not your distribution is roughly 50-50. If it isn't, it's time to make some changes. Your distribution may not be exactly even, and that's okay. You just don't want to assign yourself into only difficult or easy bomb sites. You can experiment here. Now, once you have your list of bomb sites, you can start seeing whether or not you're playing a higher or lower engagement role. Let's go through some examples. If you're playing B on Mirage, are you playing short with high engagement, or are you playing apps with low engagement? If you're playing B on Dust 2, are you playing the anchor or are you playing the rotator? Now, this isn't an exact science, but you can get a pretty good feel of how many fights you're likely to get into based on the role you're playing. If you're mid, you're probably getting into more fights. If you're anchoring the small bomb site, probably not. Now, I'm not telling you to throw out the positions that you're good at, but maybe revisit some of your sore spots. An example of this would be perhaps playing Connector on Vertigo if you've been grinding the B anchor position for a while, despite not being too successful just because you're also playing the small bomb site on other maps. Now, I couldn't end this video without discussing the drawbacks of this approach, so I'm going to put some of the biggest caveats out there. First up, if your team relies on a superstar that is outstandingly better than his teammates, then it makes no sense to not give them the roles with the most engagement. If Dawn can entry best, it's probably best that he's spammed with it. Maybe you can still play around with roles for the others, but don't fuck with the bread and butter. Secondly, harder or easier roles aren't an exact science. Playing against one team might be much harder on one area of the map than another. So having a fluid game plan might be better sometimes than having roles decided for your star player at all. This means that you can adopt a hybrid approach where although you have general distributions for roles, the most impactful players have wiggle room. This is something that is most notable when star players happen to be oppers, but you'll see plenty of riflers do it too. Well, that's all I've got to say on the subject. If this video made you think a tad bit better about CS, or you simply enjoyed the content, there's a button down there that's going to make sure that I pop up in your feed whenever I upload again.